Good morning. Thank you all for coming. I'm New York State Attorney General Eric Schneiderman. I'm very pleased to be here today to talk about a historic agreement with the Bank of America and what it means for families here in New York and across the United States. The record-breaking $16.65 billion deal with Bank of America is the latest action by the national working group that President Obama asked me to co-chair in 2012. This agreement sends a powerful message that we are going to hold financial institutions accountable for fraudulent behavior that they engaged in. We're going to hold them accountable for their role in the devastating economic crash of 2008. And for families right here in New York, it means more than $800 million in relief, $300 million in cash, and a minimum of $500 million in direct assistance to families and communities who are still struggling to recover from the 2008 economic collapse. Joining me here today are Josh Zinner, who runs the New Economy Project and also co-chairs the statewide New Yorkers for Responsible Lending. He is a statewide leader on policy relating to bank accountability and consumer protection in the wake of the foreclosure crisis, and a good colleague and ally in all of our efforts to help New Yorkers dig out of that crisis. Also joining me is Jonathan Weston, the Executive Director of New York Communities for Change, a leader at both the state and national level in urging accountability relating to economic inequality and the housing crisis in particular. Also here from my office are Stephen Glassman, Senior Enforcement Counsel for Economic Justice, Hannah Flammenbaum, Assistant Attorney General in the Investor Protection Bureau, and Dina Levy, Special Assistant to the Attorney General dealing with housing matters. I also want to give a special acknowledgement to someone who is a critical part of our work during the period I've been co-chairing the working group, Virginia Chavez Romano, who was the point person on the critically important investigation into Merrill Lynch that was a major part of what brought the settlement about. She has now moved on and is devoting her tremendous talents to serving the cause of justice at the national level as Associate Deputy United States Attorney General at the Department of Justice in Washington. So the agreement with Bank of America is a major step in the fight to hold accountable the banks that caused the mortgage crisis and brought the U.S. economy to its knees. It will bring some measure of justice to families who are still on the brink of losing their homes because of the reckless misconduct of these banks, and it will provide real assistance in helping homeowners and the communities where they live to recover. As the state's chief law enforcement officer, my guiding principle since I took office has always been equal justice under law. That means everyone has to play by the same set of rules. It doesn't matter how big an institution you are. If you violate the law, if you violate people's rights, you will be held accountable. And as co-chair of President Obama's Residential Mortgage-Backed Securities Working Group, it has been my job to see that that principle is applied to the banks whose deceptive practices in the pooling and sale of residential mortgage-backed securities brought the economy to its knees, destroying, let's just be clear on the scope of this problem, destroying trillions of dollars in home equity in 1 year in 2008 and really wiping out much of the wealth of the American middle class. We're going to be able to use the funds from this and other settlements to make a serious difference in the lives of tens of thousands of New York families who are still suffering as a result of that crash. What Bank of America did was clearly to bend the rules for its own financial gain without regard to who might have gotten hurt. Executed and announced today are a settlement agreement, but also a statement of facts in which Bank of America admits to its misconduct, and another document that sets forth the consumer relief, which we'll talk about a little more in a little moment. I think the important thing to understand here is that Bank of America itself and Merrill Lynch and Countrywide, which are companies that it acquired, sold residential mortgage-backed securities that were full of underlying mortgage loans they knew or should have known would never be paid off. They had a series of processes that were shams. They claimed that they had a due diligence process that would check to make sure that the loans were good enough and they would be paid. The process itself was insufficient. The samples that they took of loans to test to see that the quality of the loans in their securities were good were insufficient. And then even when they did go through a process to identify samples and find problematic loans, they very, very often waived them in. They just said, well, we know these are problem loans. We're putting them in the securities anyway. By the time we reached 2008, they were issuing toxic securities on a very steady basis, and anyone in any position of power knew or should have known what they were doing. So the investors were hurt who bought those securities, homeowners were hurt, and communities were hurt, because if you were in a community, even if you didn't lose your own home, that has vacant properties on the streets, your property values go down, tax revenue goes down, the local government has to maintain the property. So this is something that hit individual homeowners, but also devastated communities across New York and across America. When I took office in January 2011, I was told that all of my colleagues, attorneys general, and the Justice Department, HUD, and other federal agencies were about to enter into an agreement with 5 banks that, in my view, was wholly inadequate. And this would be an effort to put this whole period of financial crisis behind us. I said I was not going to participate in that settlement, and I was launching my own investigation. We began our investigation in the spring of 2011. And I am proud of the fact that our holdout inspired others to step up. We had great support from housing activists and people who work for a fair economy, civil rights organizations, labor unions, in saying you have to have more accountability than what's on the table, which was at that time something like $2 or $3 billion in cash and another 20 or so in modification of mortgages, consumer relief. So the president decided to take action based on this, and in the State of the Union address in January 2012, formed the task force, formed the working group that I co-chair, and this case is the 3rd settlement that we've gotten with the bank as a result of the efforts of those of us who would participate in the working group. I am proud to have pushed for the creation of the working group and to have joined my colleagues in Justice, the SEC, HUD, and other agencies in leading its efforts. It is important to understand that with this settlement, the first 3 banks we've settled with have totaled more than $37 billion in cash and relief. And if you add on to that the $25 billion or so from the mortgage servicing settlement, which we then did enter into after we started the broader investigation, we are well over $60 billion in cash and consumer relief, and well over $4 billion in cash and consumer relief for the people of the state of New York, because we set up, and we were the only state that really spent the money to set up an infrastructure of housing counselors and legal service providers. New Yorkers did much better than homeowners in other states in getting access to the relief that was available. Because if you don't, most average homeowners would not know if they were what was available from Chase, what was available through the federal government. Our HOP network, through which we now fund more than 90 housing counseling and legal services agencies, have been helping New Yorkers. They're still out there. Go to our website and find them. Go out and take advantage of the relief that's being offered. So this settlement, which, by the way, is the largest settlement in the history of the United States with a single institution. It eclipses the $13 billion settlement with J.P. Morgan Chase, also the product of our working group that was announced last fall. And what this means for working families in New York is that there's going to be more money that's going to the state, and we're going to work to see that that's spent to help the communities that were hurt and the people that were hurt, but also a menu of consumer relief totaling a minimum of $500 million for New York. And that includes, for the first time, principal reductions for borrowers whose mortgages were insured by the Federal Housing Administration. Research by our office estimates that 23% of all the distressed home loans in New York State are FHA insured. These represent the largest portion of Bank of America's portfolio of distressed loans in New York. And for the first time, these homeowners are also going to be eligible for relief. It is very important to understand that we also have received, for New York, and it's in the consumer relief, there are only 2 states that got minimums that have to be expended. The bank can expend its money for consumer relief all over the country, except that they have to spend a certain amount in New York and a certain amount in California, and we fought hard for those provisions. In New York State, in addition to the fact that we've now got FHA-insured loans into the mix, the bank has to provide a minimum of $60 million in first mortgage principal reduction to New York homeowners, including FHA-insured loans, and we hope that that's going to make a big difference in addition to the other relief that's being made available through our other settlements. We also have come up in this settlement with some groundbreaking ideas that have never been done before, which we hope will serve as a template in the future. Bank of America has agreed to transfer $20 million worth of distressed mortgages, which is to say they're going to transfer the mortgages on abandoned properties, what we've come to call zombie properties, to local governments or land banks, and then provide $20,000 per property to aid the local governments in rehabilitating or tearing down these properties. This is an incredible breakthrough because the problem of the need for funds for code enforcement, for demolition, for rehabilitation is a national crisis. At least in New York, we're going to be able to provide substantial relief to the land banks, local governments, and nonprofits who are trying to do this work. And Bank of America is going to provide a minimum of $17 million in funding to our land banks, housing counseling agencies, and legal services providers to keep the HOP program going and to continue to expand our land banks. At the end of this last legislative session in June, I was successful in getting the state to double the number of land banks from 10 to 20. So now more communities across New York can have land banks. The money will be provided to them to buy abandoned properties, to rehab them for affordable housing, to, in some cases, just tear them down for open space. This is how we're helping our damaged communities all across New York State recover from the crash. Using the resources provided by other agreements, our office's HOP network, our housing counselors and legal services have already helped more than 30,000 New York families get the relief that they need and get the guidance they need as to what they're eligible for. We want to help people stay in their homes. We want people who have lost their homes to be able to get back in the market, and there is a component of this Bank of America deal that requires them to make loans to people seeking to get back into the housing market. We are already directing $33 million to the land banks in New York State. More will come as a result of this settlement, and we will continue to work with our colleagues in local government to revitalize our communities that were damaged so badly. Because of this agreement, families all over America will be helped. Because of this agreement, we will be able to multiply the work we're doing to keep New Yorkers in their homes. No New Yorker is ever going to lose their home because they didn't have access to a lawyer or a housing counselor as long as I am the Attorney General of the state of New York. That's a commitment I made when we first started the working group. That's a commitment that I'm following through on with this agreement that is being announced today. We are going to help send a strong message that in New York we watch out for our citizens, we watch out, and that we don't care how big and powerful you are. If you hurt New Yorkers, you're going to have to pay a price. I'm very proud of the work that we've done here, and I'm very proud of the continuing work of this task force and this working group, and I look forward to speaking with you in more detail about these things. But first, I'd like to introduce a colleague, because I would never have gotten the federal government to set up the working group in the first place, and we never would have gotten all these investigations launched and all these deals cut if it was not for a coalition of leaders who really fought back against the efforts to settle cheap. And in that coalition were two of the two people who are going to speak now. First, Josh Zinner of the New Economy Project and New Yorkers for Responsible Lending. Josh.
Thank you, Attorney General Schneiderman. We commend Attorney General Schneiderman in particular for his leadership in pushing aggressive enforcement action against the biggest banks. I can't emphasize enough what a leader he's been among state AGs in pushing federal prosecutors and federal enforcement agencies to crack down on the massive abuses that led to the financial meltdown, and in raising the bar on any settlements that were entered into. And quite frankly, federal regulators have needed that push, so the Attorney General's efforts have really had a national impact. The too big to fail banks, including Bank of America, were unfortunately fundamentally responsible for the events leading up to the financial crash, as the Attorney General laid out. In particular, they fueled the crisis by the massive securitization of predatory loans, many of which were unaffordable at their inception, and then the fraudulent marketing of these securities to investors. This made predatory lending highly lucrative at all levels of the industry, and these actions devastated communities around the country, and especially communities of color and low-income neighborhoods that were targeted for abusive lending, that were fertile ground for predatory lenders. While the legal settlements do not right the many wrongs committed by the banks, at the very least the settlement announced today could bring substantial relief to some of the hardest hit borrowers. There are numerous borrowers in New York City and New York State who are underwater on their mortgages, and many of these mortgages are concentrated in communities of color, in the communities that have been hardest hit by abusive lending practices. One very positive aspect of this settlement, as I understand, as the Attorney General laid out, is that the pool of loans available for principal reduction will include many of the FHA loans that are concentrated in communities of color, in the same neighborhoods that were hardest hit by abusive lending. So this settlement will hopefully enable people in the hardest hit communities to get principal reduction relief that will allow them to stay in their homes, which will be a big benefit to New York City to New York State and New York City communities. We hope that B of A will be Bank of America will be transparent about where it's doing these mortgages, about where it's providing relief under the settlement, and that this principal reduction will in fact reach the people and communities that were hardest hit by abusive lending practices and where there have been high concentrations of foreclosure. And once again, I'd like to thank the Attorney General for his leadership in really pushing the envelope on these settlements and pushing federal regulators and prosecutors to take these actions further than they otherwise would have. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. And now I would like to introduce Jonathan Weston of New York Communities for Change, who is a real fighter for working men and women in New York on this and a host of other issues, and proud to have him as a part of our coalition fighting for justice for those who were hurt by the crash. Jonathan.
We're very glad to be here today with the Attorney General and everything that he has been moving to really hold banks accountable and get relief to homeowners. If it wasn't for Attorney General Eric Schneiderman, I don't think this settlement would be as aggressive as it is. 2, I don't think this settlement would be as large as it is. And 3, I don't think this settlement would be as stringent as it is to actually get relief to homeowners. So I want to thank the Attorney General for his leadership on everything he's done, here in New York, but also nationally to play a role to really get accountability from banks and get relief to homeowners, which is actually what this is all about. Our communities, we're a community-based organization in low-income communities throughout New York, from the Bronx to Queens, to Brooklyn, to Staten Island, to Hempstead, Long Island, where communities have seen one of the biggest losses of wealth in the history of this country, and the communities are still reeling. Thousands of families in New York have already been displaced through foreclosure. Thousands of families in New York are still underwater on their homes, where their homes are worth less than what they paid for them 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago. Their homes are still worth less than what they paid for them. And that's the type of crisis that we're dealing with today, and we are glad to be here and actually see this relief, coming down and actually getting to folks on the ground. We look forward to, actually working with the Attorney General to make sure that this relief gets to homeowners, with the primary concern being making sure that the banks are actually doing principal write-downs for families. And we're glad to hear that's a part of this settlement. And we're actually looking forward to also thinking about ways that we can innovatively use this money to have mortgages across this state written down at levels that families can actually afford to live in. Because our goal in communities is to make sure that families are made whole, to make sure that they're able to stay in their homes, and to make sure they're not paying money out of their pocket for a mortgage that isn't even worth what they paid for. So we can actually get relief to these homeowners and keep them in their homes, and that's our goal. And this is really a start to this fight, and actually how we bring relief to homeowners and families across New York. And we're happy to be here today with the Attorney General and with all the leadership he has played on this. And hopefully there will be more of these down the pike. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you all, and now we can take some questions. Matt will ask you to identify yourself and sign in, please.